Hi, it's Joe Menchevsky, the host of Better Buildings for Humans. This is a series of conversations with thought leaders about indoor environmental quality. We're going to talk about daylight, views, fresh air, and thermal comfort, and so much more. These conversations are for architects, designers, engineers, building owners, people who care about the comfort, health, and productivity of the people who work, live, and play in their buildings. Come join us if you want to be a part of the conversation. Keith Robertson is a master practitioner of sustainable design. More than 30 years ago, Keith and his partner Jennifer Corson started Soltaire Design in beautiful Halifax, Nova Scotia. Now, 30 years ago, the term sustainable design was not part of the vernacular. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that Keith and Jennifer were part of a fringe movement back then. Unfortunately for all of us, the world has caught up. Soltaire is a truly pioneering firm. At last count, they were directly responsible for more than 70 LEED certified buildings. 70. I would use the term practical visionary to describe Keith. There's so much good stuff in this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, we're recording. So, Keith, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Great. Thanks for asking me, Joe.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Keith Robertson from Soltaire in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Keith is a practitioner, and I'm going to let him tell us a little bit more about himself. Keith, let's start. Have you explain, like I said, a little bit about yourself. Tell us about Soltaire's mission. Tell us about your background and the kind of stuff that you're working on today.
Sure. Great. Yes. Well, first and foremost, I guess I'm an architect practicing in Nova Scotia. I've founded a firm called Soltaire Design, and Soltaire is sort of a made-up word that kind of makes sense. Sol and terre, sun and earth. And as you might guess, we're heavily into environment, sustainability, all of that kind of good stuff. We were founded in 1992 by myself and my partner, Jennifer Corson. And really that's been the mission right from the start, is looking at the impacts on the environment of sustainable design and construction.
So you were a little bit ahead of yourself in 1992. That's wonderful.
I was literally called the tree huggers when I used to go into some of the meetings in the 1990s, but we've kind of become mainstream since then, so that's fine. And Soltaire is actually, we say it's kind of two sides to the firm. There's a design side and there's a consulting side. So our interest in sustainability fairly naturally led into us advising other consultant teams on sustainability.
Okay. Oh, that's wonderful. And yeah, it's beautiful when the world comes along, follows along with someone who's on a righteous and good mission. So, congratulations for having that sort of foresight.
Yeah. Thank you. And we're trying to stay ahead of the curve, but it is great to see the world coming along that way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's dive in with the questions and the conversation. What makes a good building?
What makes a good building? Oh, there's a good question. There's probably a few answers to that. First and foremost, I guess it needs to be functional. It has to be useful for its intended use. But also beauty comes into it as well. And beauty goes along with, in my mind, sustainability as well. So something that's beautiful is more likely to be maintained, kept up, and cared for. We also look for things such as, sustainability is kind of a big broad term for that, and there's a whole bunch of things that fit into that. But we could simplify it and say energy efficiency would be a pretty important part. Also look for things such as livability, and that incorporates things such as access to views and good air and daylight and comfort and controllability. So that's kind of a broad scope of things that a building must do. Other things, it should be flexible. So flexible in terms of how it can adapt to technology over its lifetime, or for different uses, or be repurposed at the end of its intended use. And lastly, I would say it needs to be durable. So make it last as long as it can for its intended life. So if you do a few of those things, you've got a good building. If you do all of those things, you've got a great building.
It's funny. There's plenty of talk about energy efficiency and those sorts of things. Flexibility, huge. I mean, so much energy is consumed in actually creating a building. So if you can repurpose it at the end of its intended life, you save the energy of having to tear down a building and rebuild one and create all of the cement and the steel and all the things that go into the building. So that's absolutely brilliant. And I haven't heard that articulated before, but that's spot on.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that's starting to come into the design realm is a term called embodied energy or embodied carbon.
Yeah.
So that's all of the greenhouse gases that are emitted as a result of actually producing the building and the materials and the construction process and tearing it down again. So anytime you can repurpose a building, all of that carbon, all of that CO2, all of that is saved instead of building new.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, and I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear people having that conversation these days. It's just absolutely critical. Well, let's dive into sustainability a bit more. It's part of the reason why we're here. So what are your clients asking for? Any sort of green certifications? Let's talk about that first. How much of your work is people who are seeking these sorts of certifications, and there's a number of them these days.
The answer to that kind of comes into this dual part of the Soltaire's role. One is on our design side.
Okay.
So we have clients that come to us because of our specialization in sustainability. And on the design side, we're looking at things such as net zero or deep energy retrofits on existing buildings, healthy products or resourceful use of materials. And in that world, there are certifications for Passive House, which is a very rigorous energy standard. On the newer side, there's the Canada Green Building Council has a standard called the zero carbon. So we've got a couple of commercial projects that are pursuing the zero carbon certification. So most of our design clients have sustainability in mind, not necessarily certification in mind.
Okay.
And then on the other side, there's my part of the firm really does specialize in consulting on building certification. And most of that has been leadership in energy and environmental design. And we're seeing an increase in another rating system called Green Globes. And the zero carbon certification is coming into that now as well. So that's sort of the bulk of my work is helping teams achieve certification.
Is it a mix? Are the clients a mix between public and private sector, or does that tend to lean more towards public sector? What does the client side of it look like?
What we're seeing in Atlantic Canada is most of the requests or requirements for certification are at various levels of government, either federal, provincial, or municipal. There's not as much happening in the private world. And if I was to pull some numbers out, it's probably less than 20% of our projects that are being certified are in the private commercial industry. Most of them are public.
Okay. Okay. Now, energy consumption, net zero. Do you have clients coming to you that are just looking for better energy efficiency?
Yes, and again, on the design side, that's one of the key things is energy efficiency, and that's a pretty common metric that people are looking for. On the design side, in fact, we've got, I guess it's about a year and a half ago now, we've got Bill 57 was introduced in the province, which requires new provincial buildings to be net zero energy and climate resilient. So we've actually got that embedded in law now. So there's a discussion about what net zero energy means, which is still going on in the industry, but it certainly has started the discussion. So every project that becomes sort of a key thing. What are we looking at when we're talking about net zero energy?
What does it mean to you?
Well, I like simple definitions. So the one that I like the most says that a building produces as much renewable energy on site as it consumes on an annual basis. Now that's really challenging to do because it generally requires a lot of photovoltaics or some other forms of renewable energy. Simple to do on some buildings, very challenging to do on other buildings. So buildings generally require a decent amount of roof area to be able to do that, and not all buildings have a lot of roof area, depending on how many stories you go up. So other metrics start looking at getting a certain below a certain energy use intensity on a kilowatt hours per square meter basis. So that's some of the targets that we start to try to identify is, what are we trying to get to? Sometimes just an energy use intensity target is the first step.
Energy use intensity target. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. I've got to rewind just a little bit. I have to go down the rabbit hole just a tiny little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
When you have a scenario where you have a tall, narrow building, you sort of classic skyscraper, what other strategies do you have when you have so little roof area?
There are other, yeah, there are. So when you've got a tall building with a relatively small roof area compared to the overall building area, roof-mounted photovoltaics become a limiting factor. They're a pretty common way of doing things now, but there are other strategies too. So there are you can have a renewable building integrated photovoltaics, such as claddings that are producing electricity, even photovoltaic glass, for example. You can put on shading, awnings, canopies, things like that have photovoltaics built in. So there are other strategies that can be on vertical surfaces or on the sides of the building as well.
Okay. Okay, cool. Well, let's change gears. You talked about livability. You mentioned livability. How often are your clients asking you for assistance with livability, occupant comfort?
When we start working with clients on the consulting side and looking at certification systems, one of the categories that's kind of common across most certifications or rating systems is called indoor environmental quality. So that's where that livability comes in. It talks about having good air quality, controllability, being able to control your light levels and thermal comfort levels, and things such as low emitting materials to help maintain good air quality. But it also does include, the rating systems do include metrics for good daylighting and access to views. So definitely that's something that's in the rating systems. And our own personal view of that is that indoor environmental quality and energy efficiency are kind of the two big categories that we try to address when we start looking at rating systems.
Okay. So outside of the rating system, do your clients know what daylighting is? Do they ask about daylight in view? Do they understand the impact of natural light on a space? But what's your experience with the client's level of knowledge on natural light and views?
It varies. We have some clients that are very, very specific on it, saying that we want to meet these metrics on the LEED rating system or green globes. We want the daylight credits to achieve this certain level of performance. And we have clients that, in fact, even at the provincial levels, will do their own daylight modeling in the early design stages, just to ensure that they're getting there. Where we've seen that probably most consistently is in schools. The New Brunswick Department of Transportation and Infrastructure is very keen on daylighting and actively promotes it. So that's been interesting to watch. In our own practice, daylighting has always been very important. And as a measure of our own consulting service, we've actually started recently to include daylight simulation as part of our consulting service. So that's something that we're really trying to get it to be part of the design decision making right from the earliest stages.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm glad to see. I'm glad to see that it's becoming a little more mainstream. As as we spoke of at the beginning, the world is coming along, and the knowledge of daylighting seems to be growing. Do people ever talk about the health, wellness, productivity aspects of daylighting?
It's certainly fairly well known in the industry, but at the client level, I think it's still probably emerging knowledge. So certainly where people are asking for it is because they are very much aware of the impact. And you very well know a lot of the studies that have been done in terms of improving academic performance, improving health and wellness of occupants, including improving retail sales. I mean, there's all sorts of studies out there that show the importance and benefits of daylighting.
Yeah, very much so in academia. Slight aside, but advanced glazings, the majority of our work is in education and fitness facilities, like recreational facilities as well.
Sure.
Those would be the big two. That's those are the clients that seem to have the best knowledge of the advantages of full spectrum natural light. So
Yeah.
that's the world we tend to work in very often.
I think where there's still some improvement on how we incorporate natural light is in that early stages of energy modeling. We're still kind of focusing on thermal performance and energy systems and how we get energy into a building, and not quite as much as I would like. I was seeing the integration of daylighting and lighting power densities and things like that, how that sort of interacts in the early design stages.
Right. Keith, what do you think are the most important innovations in building technology that are going to reduce energy consumption in buildings?
There are a couple of things that come to mind. One is the increasing adoption of renewable energy technology. And at the simplest level, photovoltaic panels. And that's not a new technology. It's been around for decades, but it's becoming affordable and simple enough that it is getting incorporated into buildings. So that's a fairly straightforward and direct way of getting a low carbon energy into a building. Another one that I would see is emerging is our understanding of building envelope performance and thermal bridging. So there's been a lot coming out in the last few years about how we improve that. And there's, I think, an increased awareness of the actual elements and assemblies and connections of how envelopes go together and how they affect the building's thermal performance. So it's, again, not really a technology, but it's certainly a emerging building science.
Yeah, sometimes a deeper dive into the specifics can yield as much, as much progress as a completely disruptive new technology. So
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you the same. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
The other technology that I think there's a lot of excitement in is in glazing, and it's not just because I'm talking to advanced glazing, because I've thought this for a while. And the emergence of things such as photochromic glass and electrochromic glass and daylight redirecting glazing and light diffusing glazing and photovoltaic glazing. There's a huge development in there, and realizing that windows can do a lot more than just give you a view to the trees outside.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So same question for occupant comfort. What do you think are the most significant innovations in building science, building technology to improve livability?
In terms of technology, I would say there's not a lot new. That I think what is old is new. So things such as access to views, access to nature, just our connection to nature. Daylight, very important in our world of the consulting role. In terms of making people improving their health and wellness, there's a lot that goes into just giving them control over their environment. So that's control over things such as simple as the lighting levels in their at their workspace or classroom. Things such as the ability to increase fresh air if you want fresh air. And that might be as simple as opening a window or being able to adjust the temperature. So those go a long ways to letting people feel more comfortable in their environment. There's even studies on things such as connections to wood. So if there's studies that say people that have wood in their surroundings have lower stress levels. So again, none of those are really technologies, but there's I guess an increase in our understanding of how buildings affect us and how we interact with them.
That's interesting. You're seeing a lot more wood in commercial construction these days, and I thought it was just an aesthetic movement, but maybe there's more to it.
Well, I've always liked wood, and maybe
Yeah, of course.
maybe there is something to it as well. We're also seeing in the environmental world the introduction or reintroduction of wood at a more commercial scale, so mass timber buildings and things like that,
Yeah.
which have the benefit of locking in carbon, and so there's other environmental benefits that come along with using more wood as well.
That is interesting. All right, let's talk about something a little bit controversial.
Okay.
So I feel I feel like there is a conflict sometimes between occupant comfort and energy reduction. Views, providing more views means a larger glazed area, which often means, a lower R value on the building envelope, just as one example. Do you feel the pressure from building envelope energy performance is driving us to smaller windows, to less natural light? Is that conflict real, or is it just perceived? And if so, what are people doing to make sure that we don't go back to the 1970s with those dark boxes and the occasional punch out?
Interesting question. I don't think we're going to go to the dark boxes of the 1970s. However, there is attention being paid to the amount of glass that we have. And I think there's a really delicate balance there. So we are seeing some people saying, I want no more than 20% window to wall ratio, or, prescriptive requirements like that. I don't think that's the way to go necessarily. I think that we have a lot of buildings that have too much glass. And I think when we think about the design process, you think about what a window does. It provides light, it provides views, it provides ventilation. So what is the purpose of a window, and how you use it and where you place it becomes critical. So if the primary purpose is to do daylighting, you might want it high up in a room that provides light deep into a space. If you want its primary purpose is for views, obviously it needs to be in the view line of where people are sitting or working or standing. So by selective use of glass, we can still take advantage of views. We can still take advantage of daylighting. And the wonderful thing about daylight is, we're looking to get, 300 or 500 lux at our desks in our offices. Most people don't realize that the sunlight outside is like 80,000 lux or 100,000 lux. So it doesn't take a lot of window to get that, 0.5% of daylight into the workspaces. So careful attention to design allows us, I think, the best of both.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, obviously, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, but you're right. It doesn't take a lot of glazing to bring a lot of light in. And if you position it properly, you can push it very deeply into the space. The key is just to avoid glare, design in such a way that you keep the blinds off the windows.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, where I say that there's I've seen buildings with too much glass. I mean, there's pretty predominant use of curtain wall in a lot of commercial buildings. And I think that's going too far the other way, and produces glare, produces discomfort, and thermal gains, challenging on cooling loads, things like that. So I think there's definitely room for improvement on both ends of the scale.
Yeah, all right. So Keith, I'm sure you've answered this in the body of this conversation thus far, but we'll use this as an opportunity to summarize some of your thinking. Give me your top 3 or 4 must-haves in a modern building.
I'll see if I can get 3 or 4. First one that comes to mind is a great building envelope. So that's discussion and thought that goes into the balance of window versus wall, but also into the placement of windows, also into the thermal performance of the windows and the opaque parts of the walls. So that's things such as thermal bridging. So I think there's an emerging understanding of how that starts to interplay. So great envelope is one. Occupant controls, I think, is one, and that's for thermal comfort, for glare control, for lighting control, and another I would say is flexibility. So yes, design a building to be able to be adaptable to technology within its lifetime, to changes in space use, the aging in place kinds of thoughts, or as an organization or as a family ages, to being able to adapt to that. And then finally, to what happens to the building after its intended use. Can it be reused for something else? Can it be disassembled? So those kinds of things.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah, it's a lot of conversation about individual control these days as well. Lots of study, and I'm glad to see that happening. That sort of eternal battle between what's the right temperature, how much air should be moving. The more individual control over we have over that, the increase in livability and comfort for all the people in the building.
And
Um,
there's some really simple things too. Something as simple as an operable window.
mhm.
Um, when people have access to an operable window, they're able to withstand higher comfort ranges. So where you might be comfortable when it's 22 degrees, if you have the ability to open a window, you might be comfortable at 26 degrees. So there's that benefit as well, which kind of trickles down into energy savings as well.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. One last question. Maybe a little controversial too, but let's do it. How well connected are practicing architects to the most current research in building science?
Oh, I have to be careful with this question, being a practicing architect as well. Um, I would say in the world of building science, in envelope performance in particular, I think there's still a knowledge gap there. I think that most architects think they understand envelope performance and how energy moves through a wall. But there's new science that's coming out that's really kind of challenges that. And a very simple example would be something like we know that we should be putting insulation on the outside parts of walls right now to minimize thermal bridging as much as possible. And a very common way of doing that is with rigid or semi-rigid insulation outside of the stud or the cavities or whatever's there. And a very common way of fastening that is with a horizontal piece of steel. It's called a Z-girt. And I don't think that people fully understand that when you do that, that takes out about half the insulation value of the insulation you're putting in there. So finding other ways of doing that with thermal clips and other simple emerging products is something that I think still needs to be adopted. I'm also seeing even in Halifax right now, with the emergence of dozens of multi-unit apartment buildings, as I'm driving around and seeing the construction of them, I'm seeing envelopes that are really underperforming for what they should be doing. So lack of attention to insulation values, lack of attention to window and wall ratios, where we've got buildings that are going up with, continuous concrete cantilevered balconies, which is a pretty direct thermal bridge. And it looks to me that 90% window. So when you combine those two things in an apartment building or a condo, it's going to be not terribly energy efficient. And that's something that's built in now for the next 20 or 30 years. So somebody's got to be watching out for that. And I would put architects at the top of the list to be the first online for looking at that kind of thing.
Keith, you shared a lot of really important information today. I cannot thank you enough, and I am really looking forward to getting this out to people to digest and integrate some of your ideas into their own practices. Thank you very much for being here today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
This conversation was made possible by Advanced Glazings, helping you to make the connection to the outdoor environment through daylight and views. Solera and Solera Wow, highly insulating light diffusing glass, will help you to create buildings that are stunning and will wow everyone who enters.